Changeling Courtship Rituals by Codex X Equus. Chapter 1. The Engagement. "I see you have made it at last," sneered Queen Chrysalis, stalking out of the shadows of the cavern. "I can't begin to tell you how happy it makes me that you said yes to my proposal." "Chrysalis," growled Twilight through clenched teeth, "I don't know what you're planning or what your scheme is here, but we're not going to let you get away with it." "Ah, yes, you and your little friends." Chrysalis peered through the strands of her hair at the 5 determined ponies surrounding the alicorn. "I suppose I'll have to do something about them before we get to the fun part." "Him?" She gestured with one hoof, and Twilight fell back in shock as all of her friends burst into flames. She recoiled further, when she saw the fire was green and realized what was actually happening to them. Chittering and laughing, the 5 changelings that had entered the cave with her jumped into the air and buzzed away down a tunnel. "Wah! Wah! How?" Chrysalis let out a full-throated chuckle. "Remember when you tripped on that suspiciously well-placed branch and rolled down a hill into a bush? You found your friends when you came out of your side of the bush. But your friends found another Twilight on their side. Isn't shape-shifting wonderful? If you hurt them. Now, why would I do something like that?" Chrysalis pouted. "It's a shame you waited so long to tell me where you were going and why, though. They don't even know you're here. On the plus side, Changeling K85 348 IL. Sorry, I mean their dear, long-time friend Twilight Sparkle is now treating them to quite a wonderful picnic. Your future, however, is going to be a lot less pleasant." Twilight sent a blast of magic towards the Queen, but she had already faded away, back into the shadows. Twilight panted, stumbling forward through the green-tinged darkness of the tunnels. She had made the mistake of playing Chrysalis' game and charging after her in pursuit, instead of retreating to the entrance of the cave. Now she was well and truly lost, and to make matters worse, this wasn't merely a cave. It was a full-fledged changeling hive, and she was trapped in its depths. None of the drones had interfered yet, but it was only a matter of time until the beam of green magic came from her left side, and only her years of training let her get a shield up in time to deflect it. But that had only been a feint, and the real attack, a charging changeling queen, came from the other side. Dash's self-styled combat practice hadn't been for nothing, though. Despite how much it had resembled recreations of scenes from the Ponifu movies the Pegasus likes so much. Twilight ducked, causing the large queen to stumble over her and go sprawling across the cavern floor. She was quick with the shield as well, throwing it up in Twilight's direction even as she tumbled, but that hadn't been an attack spell the alicorn was casting. With a flash, Twilight appeared above Chrysalis, and then let loose an enormous burst of magical power right into the surprised changeling's face, blasting her back across the floor in the direction she had initially charged from. "Not so smug now, are you?" Twilight trailed off as she approached the queen's prone body, the green flames that danced around it parting to reveal an unconscious changeling drone. "No." She barely had time to protest before tendrils of green magic wrapped around her body, draining her strength and magic. With a fading cry she collapsed to the ground, and Chrysalis coalesced out of the darkness behind her. "All done," she said cheerfully, a large smile on her face. "Well, except for one last thing." Twilight hardly had the strength to watch out of the corner of one eye as Chrysalis' head descended, mouth grinning wider and opening to expose her fangs, and finally she turned away. She didn't want to be watching her murderer as the deed was done, anyway. Unfortunately, there was nothing she could do about her other senses. She felt Chrysalis' breath, hot on her neck. Felt the changeling's teeth on her throat. Felt the jaws begin to tighten, fangs starting to pierce her veins. Felt Chrysalis draw back, after putting hardly enough pressure on her neck to dimple the skin. Confused, Twilight lay there, curling into a ball, trying to protect herself, as Chrysalis lay down next to her, leaning heavily against her body and starting to groom her coat. "I don't know how you ponies can live with all this fur," chuckled Chrysalis, her hoofs working at the mud and other gunk that had adhered to Twilight's coat during the battle. "I'm not complaining about how soft and smooth it is, of course, but, well, give me good old cheatin' any day." Twilight lay there, submitting to the Queen's ministrations, mind racing as she tried puzzle out what was going on. Finally, on the basis that Chrysalis wasn't aggressive anymore, she decided to try and move away, only to be effortlessly scooped back into place by a whole hoof. Not done yet. A hoof gently teased Twilight swing into stretching out, and she gasped as the Queen began to preen her feathers, nibbling along the length of each one and working the ones that had gotten bent during her tumble across the floor back into their proper places. What are you doing?" she asked timidly, then gasped again and felt her body involuntarily relax as a particularly damaged feather, one whose discomfort she hadn't noticed until it was gone, was carefully pulled out and discarded. "I'm afraid you got a bit messy during the wedding ceremony just now," said Chrysalis apologetically. "And I can't have my new wife go around looking disheveled, now can I?" "Well, what?" I've been waiting for this day for so long." Chrysalis paused her preening to look upward with far-off eyes. "Ever since I first saw you in Canterlot, while I was posing as Cadence, I've wanted you to be mine. No other pony there saw through my disguise, no one else was smart enough to figure it all out. That's why I abandoned my plan, and sent you down to Cadence to see what he would do. I mean, I could have just killed you on the spot. But you helped her escape those caves, you outwitted my bridesmaids, and you confronted me at the wedding. Even after finding out I was a queen you didn't back down, defeating all those drones while trying to get to the elements of harmony. Impressive, even if they were under orders not to hurt you. And even after I captured you again, you still didn't give up, freeing Cadence and defeating me. That was when I knew it was true love." "What?" Chrysalis giggled, resuming her preening of Twilight's wings. "I was impressed you knew about Changeling courtship rituals. These last few years have been just incredible. I kidnap your friend's sisters, you face me down in my castle and I act like your magic was able to hurt me so you can win. You lock me in the castle for 1,000 years as punishment, then pretend to fall for that silly trick with the book so I can escape." I didn't preter. Twilight's mind locked up, stuck between trying not to encourage Chrysalis and not wanting to admit she'd been fooled so easily. "I'd heard stories and tales, but I never imagined I'd experience something so romantic until I met you. The constant battles, the fights for dominance, the carefully chosen verbal barbs hurled at each other every time we met. It was like a dream come true. I was looking forward to our next date so much, but then I thought, well, why wait? I knew there was only one pony who had a place in my heart. So I sent you that wedding proposal, and you accepted. Oh, I'm so happy." She let out a giddy giggle, nuzzling up against Twilight's head. Most of Twilight froze up at the sudden intimate contact with someone she thought of as her worst enemy, but part of her mind was still analyzing the situation and trying to figure things out. "Wedding proposal? What wedding proposal?" "All she sent me was a letter challenging me to a final battle. It said, 'My dearest Twilight Sparkle. Truly, I have enjoyed the time we have spent together. From the day we first met, I've been unable to think of anything but you. I can't get you out of my mind. I just want to wrap my hooves around you and squeeze, and never let go. If you feel the same way I do, the way I know you do, then meet me at the location on the map I've sent with this letter. I hope to see you soon. I am eager to finish this and move on with our lives together. Always yours, Queen Chrysalis." Oh, sweet Celestia, none of that was sarcasm. Twilight's train of thought was interrupted again as Chrysalis suddenly stood up. "There you go, looking as beautiful as always. The Changeling smiled cheerfully. I'd imagine you're pretty tired now, though. Come on, let's go to our bedroom. At those words, Twilight's brain once again shorted out. The situation was made worse as Chrysalis turned and directed an expression at her that she'd never imagined she'd see from the Changeling. One of worry and concern. Are you okay? Chrysalis trotted over quickly, placing a hoof against the side of Twilight's head. I didn't dream too much from you, did I? I knew I shouldn't take too much since you just became an alicorn, but I also knew that what would work for a normal pony wouldn't be enough, so I tried for about halfway between the two. But if I really hurt you then? No, I'm fine. Twilight tried to stand up quickly, only to find herself wobbling. The spell actually had taken more out of her than she'd thought. I'm really sorry. Here, let me carry you. No, really. She tried to squirm as a green glow scooped her off the ground, but it was no use, and she was deposited on Chrysalis's back. Her green shell was surprisingly soft, like a rubber mat. Chrysalis made her way through the tunnels, walking smoothly, hardly jostling Twilight at all. Embarrassed, she kept her head down, but lifted it when she noticed the hooves of other Changelings as they passed by. Each Changeling, she saw, was bowing their heads, and finally she tuned to Chrysalis. Why are all your Changelings bowing? She asked tremulously. Do you always make them bow to you? Chrysalis chuckled, looking back at Twilight over her shoulder. Of course not. For one thing, there is no need to make them bow, and I can feel their respect and dedication to me through the hive mind. But they aren't bowing to me, they're bowing to you. After all, it's not every day they meet a new queen. A new. Twilight had to stick a hoof in her mouth to keep from screaming. As a form of distraction, she tried to list all the ways this was a complete and utter disaster. It was an odd way to calm herself down, but it worked. Let's see, there's the hierarchy to think about first, she mused. If I'm still a member of the royalty of Equestria, but now I've become a queen of the Changelings, does that mean I outrank the other princesses? Oh no, what if they think this is some kind of power grab, like when Luna tried to take over? They might banish me too. Well, Luna got banished to the moon, so I guess I would get banished too. Friendship? How would that even work? I mean, I guess a literal interpretation of that would be to banish me to Ponyville, except that's not really a banishment and it's also the central seat of my power, so sending me there would be advantageous to me if anything, and... Oh Celestia, I haven't even considered the political ramifications. If we really are married, then that means our kingdoms have merged. It's been a while since I read up on the old feudal laws, but I think that means that Chrysalis's hive, being smaller, gets absorbed into Equestria, and now all the Changelings are Equestrian citizens, and Chrysalis is a princess as well, while still keeping her title and power over her lands, and this is going to cause all kinds of trouble that I can't even imagine, she finished with a gulp. Here we are, said Chrysalis happily, as they turned into a smaller tunnel and passed through an emerald green curtain of silk. Our little love nest. Twilight gulped again, and had to suppress a gag as well, but kept her head up, forcing herself to look around as they entered a twisted, depraved room that was actually surprisingly normal. There was a bit of the usual green Changeling slime around on the walls, and an overall theme that was a little too green in general for her tastes, but other than that, a bed, dressers and chests, various personal items and knickknacks strewn about, bookshelves carved into the walls that were extremely well stocked, including a few books Twilight didn't even recognize that seemed to be Changeling written. Twilight shook her head. She had other things to worry about, as Chrysalis lowered her back legs and let Twilight gently slide down onto her own hoofs. Are you all right now? Asked the Queen gently, and Twilight nodded, looking off to the side rather than meet the Changeling's eyes. Good. Give me a few minutes to put the hive mind into a resting state, and then we can go to bed. Chrysalis closed her eyes, horn glowing faintly. Thinking of the last words the Queen had said, Twilight considered trying to make a run for it while she was distracted, but gave the idea up after a bit of thought. A quick test had revealed the magic she currently had could only produce the faintest of glows from her horn. Trying to escape through the hive's tunnels while relying on the low natural light they had would be a quick route to failure. And trying to do so while Chrysalis was in direct contact with the hive mind was probably an even worse idea. She'd have to wait for a better opportunity. Looking around, she spotted what seemed to be a scrapbook sitting prominently on a table, and went over to have a look. Chrysalis hadn't specifically told her she could touch anything in the room, but, well, they were married now apparently, which meant it all belonged to Twilight as much as her. On the cover was her kitty mark. Twilight gulped again, for the third time in as many minutes, but opened the book with one hoof. She had to know. The first page had a newspaper clipping. It was from the day of the wedding, about the defeat of the Changeling Queen and the role Twilight herself had played in those events. Flipping through the book, Twilight found it mostly consisted of similar clippings, stories about Twilight and all the things she had accomplished. Defeating Sombra, becoming a princess. But most of all the ones about the various times Chrysalis and Twilight had clashed. Carefully, Twilight closed the book. She didn't know how to react to this. Part of her wanted to shudder. This was like finding out you had a stalker, and they had been collecting pictures of you and keeping track of you without your knowledge. It made her feel creeped out, as though her privacy had been violated. Despite everything in the book having coming from public publications. On the other hoof. From everything Chrysalis had known, she had been in a fully reciprocated and completely normal, in her mind, relationship with Twilight. Keeping tabs on her, saving a record of her accomplishments, being proud of her. It was actually, almost, kind of, in a way, sweet and sad. Twilight realized. How lonely had Chrysalis been, separated from the one she loved, only able to keep track of her through stories in the newspaper. How excited had she been, every time she came up with some plan to bring them together, even if she knew it was only for the briefest of times. Twilight did shudder now. Oh, Celestia help her, was she? Was she actually feeling empathy for Chrysalis? "Are you ready for bed?" asked Chrysalis from behind her, making her jump. I guess so." Chrysalis gave her a happy smile and moved around to the right side of the bed, while Twilight, eyes darting around nervously, seeking some way out, went to the left. Nothing presented itself, and she was forced to climb onto the bed. Heart-shaped, of course. Sliding on top of the silk sheets. Green, of course. She turned around quickly once in place, facing away from where Chrysalis would be laying. Twilight's breathing sped up as the large queen climbed onto the bed, nearly causing her to roll back the other way. She cringed as Chrysalis snuggled against her back, spooning her from behind, but then relaxed, slightly, as the Changeling seemed content to just lay there. "Good night, my dear," said Chrysalis softly, nearly whispering in Twilight's ear. Good night," replied Twilight. That was apparently enough, producing a happy sound from Chrysalis, and soon she seemed to be asleep. At the least she was dozing, breath even and steady, hearts, actually, she has too like an alicorn, a detached part of Twilight noted, beating gently against Twilight's back. For Twilight's part, there was no sleep coming. Far too much had happened in the last. Had it even been an hour at this point? For having her entire world flipped upside down, more than an hour had to have passed. It felt like months, in any case. Thoughts raced through her mind, chasing sleep off at every chance. Was Chrysalis serious about this? She sure seemed like it. Although there hadn't been much physical contact, other than the nuzzle or two and the preening, and now spooning her in bed of course. Not that Twilight had been looking forward to consummating their relationship, although on the other hoof there was that morbid sense of curiosity she had sometimes. One thought finally focused in her mind: escape. At the worst, should Chrysalis find Twilight had left her, and had in fact never loved her to begin with, things would go back to what Twilight had thought of as normal. Actually, scratch that. At the worst, Chrysalis, broken-hearted, would seek vengeance, her determination and ruthlessness pushed beyond all previous bounds by the pain Twilight had caused her. Between that and staying in bed with Chrysalis, Twilight decided to take her chances. Carefully, she began to slide to the edge of the bed. Her magic was still weak, but Chrysalis had put the hive mind into a resting state, whatever that meant, and she should be able to sneak past them. Especially since they would just bow if they saw her. She was almost off the bed when legs suddenly wrapped around her chest, crushing tight like steel bands and driving the air from her lungs. She struggled to breathe, but futilely, and finally gave up and slumped down to let the darkness take her. When she did, she realized that most of the tightness in her chest had been caused by her panic, and the legs. Her old legs, she noticed in the dim light. Actually weren't even squeezing that much at all. Chrysalis mumbled something sleepily, hugging Twilight even tighter and nestling her chin down on top of the alicorn's head, and Twilight puffed out her cheeks in annoyance and embarrassment as she realized she was being cuddled like a large stuffed animal. Now she had no other options but to sleep, however unlikely that was. Despite everything, though, she began to doze off within a few minutes. There was something comforting about being held like this. And so, she finally gave in and let sleep claim her. Chapter 2. The Honeymoon. Chrysalis was humming again. Twilight looked up for a moment, staring and focused at the far wall, trying not to grit her teeth. She wanted to grit her teeth, but she didn't want to grit her teeth. Because, as she'd noticed, Chrysalis only hummed when she was feeling particularly happy and content. It was a wandering tune, never the same twice as far as she'd been able to tell, and she wasn't sure if Chrysalis even knew she was doing it. Twilight really didn't want to feel annoyed by it because Chrysalis did it when she was happy. And she didn't want to start associating Chrysalis being happy with her own annoyance. But she was annoyed by it, as she knew the exact reason why Chrysalis was so happy. Because she was sitting here in the library of her hive next to Twilight, the pony she loved. The last few days had been surprisingly peaceful, aside from the occasional spine-shuddering displays of affection from Chrysalis. Twilight had been given free rein of the hive, possibly even with the option of leaving, though she hadn't dared try that since the first night. The drones had turned out to be quite friendly, they could understand her. But without shape-shifting they could only speak their own language, Hempiad, which had sounded like nothing more than buzzes and clicks to her at first. It hadn't seemed fair to ask them to change forms just because she couldn't understand them, so she'd begun learning it. She'd always had a talent for languages. Her studies had also helped with that, as she had begun going through all the Changeling written books she could find. Mostly to try and figure out exactly how she'd become married to the Queen and why Chrysalis was acting the way she was, although the temptation to look into some of the more interesting tomes had overwhelmed her more than once. What she had found was that all Changeling relationships were based on domination and conquest. There was no acrimony once the hierarchy had actually been established, but until then. Yeah, they kinda seemed like they were trying to kill you. And by seeing through Chrysalis' disguise before the wedding and calling her out, Twilight had unwittingly challenged the Changeling to a contest of dominance. There were many subtleties to Changeling relationships, and somehow what she had done, both before and after her accusations, had expressed her availability, and her interest in Chrysalis. The Queen had quite obviously returned that interest, which was technically a luckier since it had probably helped prevent the invasion from succeeding. The interesting thing was that had Chrysalis taken control of Equestria, she and Twilight would have been married on the spot. And the kingdom would have stayed firmly in the hooves of the Changelings, of course, but that was almost beside the point. Domination and conquest, that's what it was all about. The conquest of Equestria would have been the proper conclusion to a short engagement. More like an elopement. And Chrysalis would have taken Twilight as her prize. Instead, the Queen had been defeated, but in a way that left her free to try again and again. This had initiated the longer form of courtship which, Twilight had noted with dismay, was considered much more romantic. Instead of just one battle with a clear victor, they had clashed over and over again. Making things worse, while Twilight had had a few setbacks and defeats at the hooves of Chrysalis, she had won more often than not. Meaning she was at least as powerful as Chrysalis, if not more, and that just made her all the more desirable to the Queen. She was a strong spouse, a primate, one able to protect the hive and ensure its future. And the wedding, naturally, had been another fight. Except this time it had been serious, with Chrysalis giving everything she had. Because at the end, when she had Twilight helpless, when she's clamped her fangs around Twilight's neck, she had proven she was the stronger of the pair. All Changeling weddings ended in death, with the victor becoming the dominant partner. Although it was hard to think of Chrysalis as dominant right now, given the way she was fawning over Twilight. It was almost impossible to separate herself from the Queen, and Chrysalis kept asking if there was anything Twilight wanted, anything she needed, and was constantly giving little. And sometimes not so little. Displays of her affection. Currently, Twilight figured that was just post-marriage giddiness. It would be interesting to see what Chrysalis' actual personality was like once she had calmed down and they'd had more time to get to know one another. No, that wasn't going to happen. There had to be some way to fix this, to break it off with Chrysalis without hurting her, and maybe even keeping her as a friend. So, with a silent sigh, she turned back to her book. As much as she wished to browse Changeling literature some more, her relationship status needed to be dealt with. So now she was going through an Equestrian book of laws, which was surprisingly current, and unsurprisingly completely unhelpful. The problem was that, by long tradition, travelers from Equestria to foreign countries were bound to the laws and traditions of the lands they visited. There were exceptions. No one expected ponies to eat griffin meat dishes if they didn't want to, obviously. But by and large the tradition applied to everything. Which meant that a marriage to Chrysalis was, in the eyes of equestrian law, completely illegitimate. There was even a precedent for unconventional marriages due to ignorance of societal practices, set back during some of the earliest encounters with dragons. And seeing as how that union had produced a certain draconic course, the tradition seemed to be pretty ironclad. Our other hope, the fact that Changelings were an enemy nation, had been dashed as well. A simply hostile society didn't provide exemption to the tradition. Being at war with a nation did. Except, what with one thing and another, war had never actually been declared on the Changelings after the wedding. Part of it was no one had actually known where the Changelings were. No one had even known if they had a where, or if they were even technically a nation. They certainly hadn't had any kind of embassy, diplomat or capital to whom a declaration of war could be issued. And declaring war on an entire species had issues. After what had happened to the giraffes, every pony had been hesitant to do it again. Another reason was that there just didn't seem to be all that many Changelings. Attacking Canterlot with anything less than their full strength would have been foolish, and Chrysalis had shown herself to be anything but. And yet, there had still been significantly fewer Changelings than there had been Canterlot citizens. A country with the size and power of Equestria declaring war on a country with roughly the population of Ponyville would, to say the least, cause foreign and public relations problems. Resignedly, Twilight closed the book. There was no hope there. There was no hope anywhere, as far as she could tell. She was well and truly screwed. Quite literally, to judge by the looks Chrysalis had been giving her. Although there was one pony who had always been able to help her. She got up, moving out of the library while frowning in thought, not paying attention as Chrysalis suddenly noticed her absence and scrambled to her hooves, buzzing through the air momentarily in her haste to catch up. The next day, Twilight left the hive. Exiting the cave that marked the main entrance to the hive, she stopped, closing her eyes and turning her face up to the sun, happy just to feel its warmth on her face again. The hive wasn't bad, in fact the caverns made it pleasantly cool, but she had spent her whole life in the sun and had missed it even in the few days she had been underground. Looking around hesitantly, Twilight walked further from the cave mouth. The hive was hidden in the southern part of Equestria, in the Macintosh Hills, and she purposefully kept her eyes to the right as she climbed to the top of one of the larger nearby hills. Finally, she turned, and beheld all of Equestria, or at least the general region she called home, spread out before her. Ponyville was easily identifiable, being the only city on the plains near the ever-free forest, and even if it wasn't her castle shone in the sun like a beacon. Equally noticeable was Canterlot, hanging off the side of the mountain that shared its namesake. Twilight sat, staring at the two cities she called home equally, and felt a pit of longing opening up in her stomach. She missed her home. She missed her friends, she missed Spike, she missed her family, she missed everything that Ponyville and Canterlot meant to her. For a moment she was tempted to leave. Just leave, teleport back to her home, or at least teleport most of the way and then fly. She could expose the Changeling that was currently taking her place, report the location of the hive to Celestia, and they could have the royal guard on their way here within the hour. Chrysalis and the hive, or at least most of the hive, would no doubt be long gone by then, scouts, spies and the hive mind having given them ample warning about what was coming. But they would have received a message they couldn't ignore, that Equestria wouldn't tolerate their presence inside its borders. And if Chrysalis was foolish enough to stay and fight, she'd be defeated easily, and they could lock her up somewhere for real this time. Except those thoughts, to Twilight's surprise, produced similar feelings to her homesickness. She couldn't do that to Chrysalis. She couldn't break her heart like that. That wasn't even breaking her heart, that would be something so far beyond betrayal Twilight didn't even have a word for it. And the thing was, she actually liked Chrysalis. Not liked her, of course not. That would be ridiculous. She could never reciprocate Chrysalis' feelings for her. Even though sometimes no. But the Queen was fun to be around. She was strangely silly at times, and any conversation with her was bound to turn out interesting, whether she displayed a cruelty of thought that was chilling or an amazingly considerate analysis of others' situations and feelings. Changelings fed on emotions. For some reason, Twilight had hypothesized, this gave their queen an utter lack of control over her own emotions. Her reaction to anything seemed to be at the maximum level of emotional investment. Thus, a Changeling who had come in to report a failure had triggered a towering rage the likes of which Twilight had never seen. Chrysalis had begun throwing around blasts of magic that had looked likely to kill the unfortunate drone, and only Twilight's intervention, it seemed, had saved him. And yet, when several Changelings had been injured in a small cave-in, Chrysalis had displayed a concern near panic. The tenderness and compassion she had given the injured had met, and possibly surpassed, anything Twilight had ever seen from a pony. Again she had had to intervene, this time to stop Chrysalis from working herself into exhaustion from caring for the Changelings. The contrast was intriguing, to say the least. But those two incidents had highlighted a different problem. Twilight could, to a degree, control Chrysalis now. The Queen loved Twilight so much that she'd do anything the Alicorn said, even when so consumed with rage she seemed out of control. Which created a conflict for Twilight. Her role as a princess of Equestria meant she had to consider what was best for the kingdom. And that responsibility practically demanded she keep control of Chrysalis, that she remain married to the Changeling even if she couldn't return her love. Removing the threat Chrysalis posed, actually turning her into an ally instead of merely imprisoning her, should take priority over everything else. Except she was also the princess of friendship. And friendship didn't mean staying in a loveless marriage in order to brainwash some pony into doing what you wanted them to do. No matter what Pinky said. Finally, Twilight climbed back to her hooves. Giving Canterlot and Ponyville one last glance, she began making her way back to the hive. She sighed. Coming out here hadn't made her conflict any clearer. Still, all she could see were the two options, and neither was appealing. But seeing Canterlot had reminded her again that there was one pony who always seemed to have an answer to her problems. Maybe she would be able to see third choice where Twilight couldn't. "You left the hive today," said Chrysalis quietly, breaking the silence that evening as they walked through the tunnels towards the... Well, Twilight had just been thinking of it as the cafeteria. There were a number of ways she could have responded, but Twilight just settled for saying, "Yes, I did," and letting the silence fall again. Her nerve broke first, though, and so she broke the silence the second time. "Were you spying on me?" "You have bodyguards. They were following you. I can't let anything happen to you." Chrysalis looked away, not meeting Twilight's eyes. "And?" "Yes. I want to know where you are. All the time." That was perfect example of Chrysalis' unique brand of creepy sweet. But at least it gave Twilight a good opening to make a request. "Chrysalis, there's something I want to ask of you," she said, glancing over at the Changeling. She wasn't quite sure how this was going to go down. "Anything, Twilight," Chrysalis replied eagerly, earlier awkwardness instantly forgotten. Twilight took a deep breath. "I want to go to Canterlot." Chrysalis looked at her in surprise for a moment, then burst into an excited smile. "You do? Excellent. I can have 3 legions assembled within the hour, and we can march on Canterlot by..." "Chrysalis, we have talked about this," said Twilight firmly, interrupting the Queen. "We are not invading Canterlot or taking over Equestria, and I'm not usurping the throne. But I would be a much better ruler of Equestria. We would be better. With us in control, soon the entire world would be." "I said no, Chrysalis. For one, the princesses are my friends. That's why I want to go visit them and let them know what's happened." She leaned over as they walked, giving Chrysalis a bump with her shoulder. "You know what friendship means to me. And a coup d'etat isn't the kind of thing you do to friends. I'm hoping I can at least get you to learn that someday." "The princess wasted your potential," grumbled Chrysalis, giving in. "If I'd gotten a hold of you first, we'd be unstoppable." Twilight let out a loud, melodramatic sigh and rolled her eyes, producing the wanted response from Chrysalis, namely, a soft giggle. "Thank you," said Twilight sincerely. "You know I'd do anything for you," replied Chrysalis, cheating on her face darkening slightly as she blushed. "I love you." Twilight remained silent, suddenly uncomfortable. Thankfully, she was saved from having to make a response by them entering the tunnel entrance to the cafeteria. "I'm thinking chicken wings today," mused Chrysalis, then looked over guiltily at Twilight. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean." "Do we have to go through this every time you eat meat?" Twilight rolled her eyes. "For real this time. It's not like I don't have griffin friends. And not all ponies are strictly herbivores, either. We have omnivorous tendencies, on occasion." "Have you ever eaten meat?" asked Chrysalis curiously, tilting her head to the side. "I have," replied Twilight hesitantly, remembering the cafeteria. A real cafeteria. In a certain alternate universe high school. "Actually, there's something I had once that I really liked. Do you think I could maybe get it here? It was called a hot dog." Chrysalis looked at the Changeling server, who shook his head, then turned back to Twilight. "Sorry, I don't think we have any dog right now. It's usually not very good, anyway." "No, it's not made of dog. It's pork, and it's all kind of ground up and put in this casing, and served on a bun." Twilight made a rolling motion with her hooves, then gestured as though she were placing one object inside another. Both Changelings, Queen and Servant, gave her blank looks, and she let her head fall. "Never mind," I'll just have a hay burger, thanks. The two royals sat down at one of the tables that dotted the room, stretching out side by side. Like the Naponess, Changelings preferred low-slung tables that they sat on the floor in front of, rather than the chairs and taller tables of Equestria. It was one of the few details that gave Twilight the suspicion that the Changelings had originated to the east, and had only recently migrated near Equestria. One skill Chrysalis had, Twilight had to admit, was an ability to set her at ease, and by the time their food was served she was snickering and trying to smother her laughter with a hoof. Perhaps it was part of the uncontrolled emotion thing, but Chrysalis' sense of humor was wickedly funny. So relaxed was she, in fact, that as she ate and ruminated on her problems, she leaned up against a large form next to her, wiggling herself into a comfortable position. Her burger suddenly froze partway to her open mouth and she struggled to contain a whimper, as she remembered who she was sitting beside. It was a natural reaction, she supposed. After all, how many times over the years had she been in this exact position with Celestia, reading a book, studying magic, having a simple talk, or even eating just like this? After a certain point, snuggling up against the large form laying next to her had become an unconscious response. On the other hoof, there wasn't much to complain about here. Aside from Chrysalis' cheating being a bit cooler than Celestia's fur, this felt just as familiar and comfortable. So, with a silent sigh, Twilight went back to eating her meal. Only to pause once more, trying not to grit her teeth. Chrysalis was humming again,